Morning, San Francisco and the US. Good afternoon, Switzerland and Europe. Good anything, the rest of the world. Welcome to our event this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are. Geneva Talks, Technologists and Humanitarians Unite. I'm Gioia Deucher, the CEO of Swissnex San Francisco, and the Geneva Talks are a collaboration between Swissnex San Francisco, the Consulate General of Switzerland in San Francisco, and the Republic and Canton of Geneva. They are inspired by the conviction that technology is key to the future of humanity. And these talks explore that symbiotic relationship between technology and humanity. So we are here today to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the UN Charter. Indeed, actually 75 years ago, the world was just about recovering from the two world wars, and the governments of 50 countries came together in San Francisco to establish the United Nations. Of course, the UN of today is not the UN of 1945. The organization has seen many ups and downs. But at the same time, Geneva actually remained a center of humanitarianism, and it is the host to numerous UN and other multilateral organizations. And every day, key decisions that save or improve the lives of people anywhere in the world are taken in Geneva. Often these are actually not reported in the international media's headlines, but they do make a crucial difference in the lives of all of us. Geneva is a very dynamic and lively ecosystem made up of 38 international organizations, over 400 NGOs, 179 permanent missions, but also, of course, other stakeholders like companies and universities. So it is truly a unique combination of stakeholders that work together to improve the state of the world across fields like human rights, environment, trade, health, humanitarian aid, digital policy, etc. So today we find ourselves in another crisis, a global crisis. COVID-19 has transformed our daily life, and it has highlighted just how interconnected today's world has become. And this is what we will talk about today. Before I briefly introduce our moderator of this event, let me cover a few tech specs here. So there is a Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. You can actually ask questions anytime throughout the event. Feel free to do so. Our moderator, Ludwig, will weave them into the conversation or respond to them at the end of this conversation, depending on how it just fits. So please feel encouraged to ask your questions anytime. Also note that this event is being recorded and will be broadcast and will be actually put up online after the event. I also want to give a quick thank you to one of our special partners for this specific event, which is the International Committee of the Red Cross, which actually worked with us today. And we obviously have a speaker from the Red Cross here with us today, but also they helped us in the background to put together this event today. Thank you for that. Now on to the moderator, with no further ado. Our moderator is Ludwig Siegele. He is the US technology correspondent for The Economist, and he has been a technology correspondent for over 20 years across Berlin, London, and since last year, he's back in San Francisco where he initially started his career. So he's been covering the IT industry and technology more generally. So he obviously has very deep insights into the world of technology and also its potential pitfalls, but also uses across different fields that affect all of us. So Ludwig, it is my pleasure to pass the word on to you, and we really look forward to a fruitful conversation with a set of very outstanding speakers that joined us today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gioia. Thanks for that kind introduction, and good morning and good evening and everything in between to the attendees of this webinar, this panel. So at The Economist, we like to simplify and then exaggerate, and so I would slightly like to rephrase the theme of this panel. So the question I think we have to look at is technology and humanitarian work, friend or foe? Do they work together? Do they kind of reinforce each other, or do they don't work together? And how can we make them friends, technology and humanitarian work? And before we get going, I'd like to quickly introduce the panel. And I'm going to do that by just asking all panelists a quick question. We have basically a two-tier panel. We have, of course, two humanitarians, and we have two technologists. And so, Lene Wendland, let me ask you first. Your title is Chief of Business and Human Rights Unit of the Chief of Business and Human Rights Unit at the UN, and that's so often with the UN, that's a mouthful. Could you give me in 2 sentences what you're actually doing there?
Thank you, Ludwig, and good afternoon from Geneva. Yes, I work in the UN Human Rights Office, which is the lead agency for human rights within the United Nations. And the work I do lead is focused on the responsibilities of business when it comes to human rights. Most people think about human rights as something only for states, but there is a big and growing field of understanding for what are the expectations of companies. And in the last year, I've been leading a new project that is focused specifically on the technology companies and the responsibilities in responding to some of the global challenges that arise from tech, but also how tech can be a tool to try to address some of those challenges. So that's what I do.
Thanks, Lene. Balthasar Stachelin, let's move on to you. You just were appointed Director of Digital Transformation and Data at the International Committee of the Red Cross. Again, in 2 sentences, what does that mean, and what are you going to do at the Red Cross? Oh, I think we've lost Balthasar, so let's move on. Rakesh, you are a technologist, and you work for Salesforce.org, and you're in charge there of humanitarian impact data. Give us an idea what Salesforce.org is and what you do there. You have to unmute, sorry.
No worries. So good morning or good afternoon. So Salesforce.org is the social impact side of Salesforce. So we work specifically with the nonprofits, and in my portfolio, engagement with the humanitarian community is part of what I do. What we're working on fundamentally is how does technology, and specifically data and evidence, drive impact of the global international humanitarian community? And of course, obviously that includes things like COVID-19.
Okay, cool. Last but not least, Philipp Stauffer, you are a managing partner or the managing partner at Firefly Venture Partners, a VC firm based in San Francisco. But you're also a bit of a privacy activist or blockchain activist. Is that right?
Well, I wouldn't call myself activist, but clearly a supporter of decentralized technologies. So yes, Firefly Venture Partners, we're a venture firm, early stage venture firm in San Francisco, in Silicon Valley, but we have deep roots into Switzerland as well. I was born and grew up in Switzerland and moved to Silicon Valley in 2001. So there's a little bit a bridge of what we're talking about today as well between Geneva and San Francisco and Silicon Valley. And we invest, so we support early entrepreneurs who build their competitive advantage through data and intelligence. So we're very much focused on data-driven solutions. From that perspective, clearly it comes with interesting issues these days around like, okay, what can we do with data? And then on the other hand, what should we do with data? And how do we protect privacy and identity of users? And I think that's probably one of the key themes we talk about today as well.
Thanks, Philip. Unfortunately, we still don't have Balthasar back, so let's dive right in. And kind of an opening question to all of you, kind of to see where you're coming from. So I've written about tech in humanitarian work quite a lot over the years, and kind of the general approach seems to have been that there's, as kind of was said previously, there's this symbiotic relationship between technology and humanitarian work, that technology really helps when it comes to solve humanitarian crises. Over the years, I've become more and more of a skeptic. So I just wanted to know from you, where do you sit? Kind of, do you think, or what do you think the role of technology in humanitarian work can be? Is it good? Is it bad? Lene, let's start with you again.
Thank you, Ludwig. I think it's not a binary answer to that question. I think in the UN human rights, we have as a sort of starting position tech as a tool and tech as a challenge, and I think that it certainly can be both. I think there are huge opportunities also in humanitarian work. I should say that I don't work specifically in humanitarian work, but just from the sort of general human rights work that we do, I mean, human rights can be an incredible, or technology can be a huge tool for the work we're doing, human rights investigations, monitoring, etc. But of course, there are the very well-known challenges. So I think for us, we want to try and focus on how to identify and mitigate the risks and the challenges that are. And I mean, just from, I know that some writers talk about surveillance humanitarianism. So just from that field, that of course, when you are working in a refugee camp, when you're handing out food aid, technology can be a huge aid in what you're doing. But at the same time, the risk of conditionality, when you make certain biometric data conditions of aid, the risk of false identification, the risk of discrimination, etc. So it's less about friend or foe. I think it's around how one can most effectively mitigate the risks and enhancing those positive contributions that technology can play, both in human rights and in the broader humanitarian space.
Balthasar, I hear you're back. Can you hear me? Doesn't seem to be the case. So Rakesh, let's move on to you. I mean, where do you sit? Kind of how do you think, what role can technology play?
I think technology has an absolutely critical role to play in modern humanitarian affairs. You simply cannot respond at the scale necessary to a modern crisis without it. I mean, obviously, COVID-19 is a great example because suddenly every humanitarian organization, whether they were leaders or laggards on technology, suddenly had to undergo an unplanned emergency digital transformation within the last 120 days. You know, everyone's moving to virtual and stuff. That said, it is incumbent upon the technology community to demonstrate that it is relevant and appropriate to the moments and places where humanitarian work gets done. Because obviously, working on the ground in Syria or Yemen is a very different experience than, you know, working out of a coffee shop in San Francisco. And so it is incumbent, and I think part of the cultural transfer between the two camps is to make sure that that technology is well suited and protective for the moments where and places where the work gets done.
Okay, Philipp, question to you before we move on to Balthasar. I think you have to unmute too, sorry.
Yeah, got it, apologies. Technology, it's challenging. Yeah, so I think from a venture and entrepreneurial perspective, I definitely, I have to say, because I truly believe it, that technology can be a big factor, but I think it's a combination of human and machine. And when I look at Silicon Valley, sometimes I feel we're in love with technology here. We feel just if we put technology out, it will solve problems. And if you look at humanitarian challenges, where, for example, data privacy is actually not just let's say a matter of, okay, does now somebody see which ad I clicked? But if violations there happen, people die, or people go to jail, or people disappear. And I think Silicon Valley sometimes is a little bit too much in love with itself about, okay, let's put technology out without really having that intersection of really understanding what implication it could have. And also, I don't feel the collaboration between humanitarian organization and technology, with large organization, it's greatly organized, but let's say with the startup ecosystem, I think there could be done much more, because I truly believe that there is benefit of human and machine coming together. And the human factor, of course, plays a role there as well. I mean, we know the saying, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I feel like the last 15 years, we kind of all played in a sandbox with technology, and we all kind of found it funny that, okay, now Ludwig sees a different ad than I see, for example, or we can optimize a little bit our let's say, experience we see online. But I think the next 15 years will get pretty serious. And I think we probably got that wake-up call in 2016 around how data was used globally in elections, not just in the US, but in other countries as well. And I think we have to wake up to that fact and be more responsible.
Thanks, Philipp. So Balthasar, finally, I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. So before I let you answer that question about you, so you've just been appointed director of digital transformation and data at the International Committee of the Red Cross. I mean, tell me what that is and what you're going to do.
Okay, no, thank you. Fantastic to be here. Good morning and good afternoon, good evening to all of you. And it's great to be able to join this conversation, and apologies for some technical issues I had here in Geneva. So basically, the International Committee of the Red Cross working in armed conflict does not only want to look at how, in a way, digital transformation transformed perhaps the way we do our work, which is to protect and assist populations in situations of war, but it's also how digital disruption actually will hit our organization, the overall humanitarian section. What does it actually mean? And it is way beyond just digitizing our response. It is fundamentally altering the relationship we have with beneficiaries, with belligerents, with parties. So we will have to think about it, and the kind of connection with the Bay Area, with tech companies, is for us a huge opportunity. So in the sense that technology is a massive enabler, but it's a double-edged sword. And it's all, in my view, if I had to encapsulate the kind of key word, the master word we should look at, it's trust. The ICRC, our commodity is trust. So people trust us to go into rebel areas. They trust us to visit prisoners. They trust us not to be instrumentalized, not to be used for political military gain. So how can we use technology, which is massively enabling, without losing the trust, and ideally reinforcing the trust? And the trust issue is also an issue, I would sort of say, for tech companies. So I think we have to connect on these issues. And as some of the other panelists said earlier on, trust may in certain contexts be more the inconvenience of losing privacy, and that can be quite harmful in it. But in war zones, it may be really losing your life. And if you suddenly are associated to unwillingly having caused harm, physical harm, to the people you try to protect, you have, in a way, the worst case scenario, and you lose your license to act, so to say.
Thanks, Balthasar. I mean, it's been kind of, I think Rakesh mentioned that earlier on, is kind of this and Philipp, this techno-solutionism in the Valley. And kind of having lived here, when the pandemic started, it was interesting to see kind of, it was almost a default. Let's kind of fix this with an app or fix this with some technology. But isn't kind of the lesson of this pandemic that it's actually much more, at least in the beginning, much more about kind of very basic low-tech infrastructure which we need, and which this country, the US, doesn't have, at least to some extent. Rakesh, what's your experience? Have we in the pandemic kind of jumped too quickly to thinking that we can just develop these tracing apps and solve that problem?
That's a great question. I think that Silicon Valley has a culture of moving fast and having a lot of really smart people who have a lot of agency. And so when a crisis happens, there's a very obvious need. And Silicon Valley as a culture, generally speaking, wants to do good, right? Like the intentions are good. And this comes all the way back from Silicon Valley's origins in the 1960s and the counterculture movement and things along those lines. So that's deeply ingrained here. Is we want to do good. We don't just want to make a paycheck. But when you move fast, especially in a crisis situation is very different in that the underlying reality keeps shifting out from underneath you. And this is true whether it was Ebola in 2014, 2015, a natural disaster, or a conflict situation. The underlying reality has to go. And so it's incumbent upon us as technologists to deeply understand the problem space that we're engaging in. A use case that may be appropriate in one context may not be appropriate for this context. And I think one of the big things that needs to happen is this kind of collaboration between humanitarians to inform the logic of the applications, to inform the logic of the technology and what the technology will actually do, right? So we're the technical experts, but we always have to remember that we are fundamentally, we're not responding to technology emergencies. We are responding to human emergencies of various sorts. And so we have to be engaging with the people who are the frontline workers who actually have the mission and mandate to actually perform those missions and say, what does the tech actually need to do? And how do we know what success looks like?
Thank you, Rakesh. Lene, and please unmute yourself. From what you just heard, kind of, if you look at what happened in the past few months and the tracing apps, I mean, do you think business, the technology industry has really listened, or did they kind of impose a solution?
I mean, I think I want to go back to the issue of trust. I think that's really, that is whether these tracing apps, for example, are going to work or not. It really comes down to trust, and it's a trust between individuals, citizens, and their states and the governments, as well as trust between the companies and citizens. And if you don't have that, and if you don't invest in understanding the needs, so both from frontline workers, but also for the contact tracing apps, people need to be confident that that these kind of tracing apps are going to be used for a very specific purpose. And then I think if there is a good trust between in a sort of social contract, most people will understand that they will give away some of their privacy rights and some of the other fundamental things that happens when we don't have a pandemic in order to achieve that. But in a situation where there is no trust, and where there is a history of government surveillance and conflation of, we are pursuing a legitimate policy goal, but actually as a government or indeed as a company, we are slipping some things under either for repressive purposes or financial purposes. I mean, those kind of things, I think, have been come out in this pandemic situation, that the underlying trust issues in society that predated the pandemic is really playing itself out when it comes to the issue of the app. I just saw, was it France who introduced a contact tracing app, and there was 1.8 million people that signed up, and the next day, it was 1.2, because people actually, once they thought about it, they just got rid of that app because they weren't comfortable that it was going to be used for the purposes that it was needed. So from our side, it really is about the general sort of trust between people and who is developing or running these apps, and how do you have that trust? You do have that with broader protective systems and a lot of consultation and a lot of understanding of the context, and saying to people, we are going to do this for you in our collective interest, but we are not going to abuse or take advantage of the situation.
I mean, you mentioned the French app, and I think that's a pretty representative experience with many of those apps as far as they are available. And what we see is fragmentation. You see all the problems you can expect, kind of incompatibility of solutions and all that. I mean, do you think that kind of tracing apps, that's a fixable problem, or we just have to learn, or do you think that's kind of broken as a system, and we won't get there where we want to go?
I mean, it's obviously in a pandemic situation, you don't have a lot of time to do a lot of consultation, but I do think that this notion that those who are developing the app, I mean, take that context into consideration. I mean, we call it human rights due diligence, where you look at what is the impact, and then as quickly as possible, you get that understanding out, and you take that into consideration as you're building the app. Again, the time pressure is not ideal, but I just don't think we're going to achieve the goal the valuable goals that these contact tracing apps are seeking without investing in understanding and assessing what is the context in which they're going to be used, and who are the users, and what is the national, local context in which they're going to be used. And again, that will vary between different societies. I mean, there are societies in Europe that have, and elsewhere, that have a high level of sort of trust between the state and its people. In other contexts, that is not the case. So you can't overcome that issue, but by understanding it and taking it into account as you're developing, you might mitigate some of those issues in the implementation and rollout of the design and implementation and rollout.
Thanks, Lene. I mean, Balthasar, and also on the tracing apps, I mean, from where you sit in Geneva, I mean, it seems to me that it's a holy mess, and it's going to take a long time to be fixed. But perhaps you have a different assessment.
I have indeed a slightly more upbeat assessment, and I think what is interesting with these contact tracing apps, but it shows that if you don't have data protection by design approach, which data protection doesn't come after the technology, but from the very start, you think, how do you deploy technology that actually is thoughtful and responsible about data protection? People will simply not use it. And then the best technology will not work. That's where the human element comes into it. It's interesting that here in Geneva, Switzerland has just today actually deployed a tracing, a contact tracing application that has a decentralized system, so data protection by design. I'm not saying there is no debate around it. I think the jury is out on how many people will download it, but I think there is far greater positive energy around that solution, and indeed, it's a dilemma. You have to put the code. So do you want to upload data on everybody by GPS and have a lot of data that some public health officials, because I recently published a blog on the issue, they angrily wrote to me and sort of say, why would you advocate for a decentralized system where we don't have exactly all the information that allows us to act? And I sort of say, well, a centralized application may simply not be used, so you won't have that data, whereas a decentralized solution as the one that is now being deployed in Switzerland, I think has a good chance that people will accept to use it, and I think that the kind of safeguards that were done around it, they seem very thoughtful. The code is open to challenge, it's published, and I think we will know in about a week or two how many people will have downloaded it. Will the technique that is actually, without going into details, Bluetooth based, so it's a kind of exchange of crypted keys via Bluetooth to see whether people actually, and it's all on your phone, and if someone is then positive in terms, this generates keys. I don't have the time to go into all the details, and I wasn't personally involved, but I as a private citizen, I actually downloaded it this morning because I think it's worth the try, and on balance, and we are at the ICRC, I'm not talking on behalf of the ICRC, but I'm very stringent. It's part also of my job to push the ICRC to be very stringent on data protection. But I think the balance that was struck with the decentralized system is actually worth the exploration. And we have to make these judgment calls, and we have to look at the larger picture, at what can societies then do with such an information. Do they have the medical structure? Do they have the testing capacities? Do they have the isolation capacities? It's only a small chain, a small part of a longer chain, which is as strong as its weakest link. But I think I find it a little bit too early to sort of say it's a mess, it won't lead anywhere. I think the jury is still out, and we will see how it works. And the trust-based, I would argue, have a great... Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you again. Technology. Now, I mean, you can certainly at length discuss kind of whether you need a centralized or decentralized solution, and it probably depends. But there was a political problem that, in the way that the decentralized solution was basically imposed by two big companies, Google and Apple, and that of course is a problem, or is probably perceived as an imposition, or kind of or world domination by big tech. Do you think that was a problem? That is a problem, or kind of how could that be solved? I mean, I mean, it really seemed to be kind of like a diktat in that case.
I think what it shows is in a way how big tech companies, the kind of power they have, the kind of influence to have, but also the kind of responsibility they have to try to solve problems that face societies, and here actually the global society. In my view, I much prefer that they came down on the side of decentralized system or centralized system. I think it would have been a totally different debate if they had sort of said we only sort of work to help systems that work only by uploading of information to whoever is the authority, because that has far greater potential of abuse. Whereas I think in this sense, they work together to render possible a solution that is as stringent on data protection as it technically today can be. And in this sense, I find that now a positive example rather of tech companies coming in and helping to find solutions, but it clearly shows that the power these tech companies have, and side or the other will shape policies now in public health, and tomorrow maybe on the law, which in a way governments cannot control any longer. And I find that is a very interesting evolution, which means also that we have to engage with these companies, and that the companies have to engage with states, with civil society, in a way that is concomitant to their influence and to their power.
Thanks, Balthasar. Rakesh, I mean, if you look at if you look at the tracing apps and kind of the architecture Google and Apple have developed jointly, I mean, what do you think? How has that kind of, what was that the cooperation between governments and big tech? I mean, did that work the way it was supposed to, or do you think it should happen differently in the future?
So one of the things that I do, and one of the things I do when I talk to humanitarians is I say you need to approach the big tech companies as if they were states, because the large tech companies actually have equivalent power to states, whether they are Apple or Facebook or Google. And just for the record, I was actually on the Apple privacy team. So the team that actually helped shape the privacy of that system was one that I'm very familiar with. What I can say is that people on the Silicon Valley side do try very hard to want to move fast, right? So especially in the pandemic when things are literally growing at an exponential rate, the kind of consultations and the kind of speed that sometimes happens in the hallways of New York or Geneva sometimes just isn't right for the moment, right? Like it's not responsive enough to a sudden onset crisis. And so you have to figure out how to de-risk the situation. And, the ICRC came out with its data protection handbook. OCHA has one. The Harvard Humanitarian Initiative has the Signal Code. And these are all practices that are generated from within the humanitarian community about what data protection and what appropriate data looks like. And I think that we need to figure out how to build a capacity collectively for these rapid response onsets, because guess what? COVID-19 is not going to be the only one. We live in a time of huge shocks. So we see the COVID-19 crisis right now around the world, but there's also going to be a hunger crisis. Very shortly, 350 million people are facing extreme hunger by the end of this calendar year. We are seeing the extreme global poverty going up for the first time since 1998. And so technology, to the extent that it can and should be a part of the solution, I think we have to collectively, from both sides of this conversation, lean into this conversation to build those bridges, because we cannot wait until the crisis happens to all of us to figure out how to work together.
I mean, you mentioned earlier when we prepared this panel, kind of the cultural rift between technologists and humanitarians. I mean, give me a bit more color on that, and also kind of ideally, how would you like this to happen?
Sure.
This cooperation. I mean, do we need institutions? Is it? I mean, yeah.
I think Silicon Valley is very fond of the word disrupt. Move fast and break things was the old Facebook motto. Except moving fast and breaking things doesn't work when you're dealing with fundamentally vulnerable people, right? So who have very little agency in their own choices and in their own lives, right? And where if I'm a technologist and I do something wrong, someone at the very end of that chain may suffer immense grievous harm, and there's really no way for that person to hold me accountable for it. And so the accountability and transparency mechanisms that are necessary for this kind of thing at a scale, I don't think are quite there yet. And at the same time, starting in about 2015, it was my sense that a lot of humanitarian organizations got sort of Silicon Valley religion. Everyone started having an innovation team. Every little NGO, every UN agency had like an innovation team. And in my mind, innovation has to go hand in hand with risk reduction. And in the conversations around risk reduction from the humanitarian community are almost academic. There's a lot of papers, there's a lot of practices, but what does that actually mean in software? What does that actually mean on the network? What does that actually mean as the bits move around? That's really where the private sector has the expertise. But right now, there is no mechanism to actually help inform the private sector on what humanitarianism is all about. Like, we can talk about humanity, neutrality, impartiality, but if you're sitting in San Francisco or San Jose, there's no training, there's no education from Geneva to Silicon Valley saying this is what humanitarianism is. It's almost assumed that you already know what it is.
I mean, Philipp, you work with startups, smaller companies, not big tech. I mean, how does that work there? Kind of the cooperation between the people you work with and humanitarian organizations.
Yeah, it's just quickly a thought on the last point as well, and the jump to this. Like, I think the trust point that Lene and Balthasar mentioned is, I think, the key one, right? And as we think just about the user, on what Rakesh just said, is like, let's say the tracing app, consumers don't really know what decentralized and centralized really means in technical detail. Many few know. They have to have some type of, let's say, trust level to say, okay, because it comes from the, let's say, ICRC, I trust it, right? And then we need to be sure that what ICRC puts out is actually absolutely bulletproof, right? And I think that's the tricky thing, because that there is definitely potential for a lot of collaboration there, but kind of what gets lost in translation in between startups and NGOs and humanitarian organizations can really mean that somebody goes to jail or gets killed or disappears. And so I think there has to be a framework or requirements that we as a startup ecosystem have to sign up for. And on the other hand, has to be defined by humanitarian organizations, so that we know exactly where we meet and where we have to meet in order to not put anybody at risk, right? Because if I would ask, I mean, anybody I asked about tracing apps right now, consumers who are not in technology, and they say, yes, absolutely, it has to protect my privacy. And then I ask, well, how so? Very little ideas came back. And it kind of should be that way, right? Because if I get diagnosed with cancer, I'm not supposed to know like all the implications of what that means. I have my doctor for that, and I do my own research, but I'll also be an amateur about it. And the same thing should be true for technology and consumers. And so I think what's missing is this, I don't know, this framework or blueprint for where does technology innovation and these really risky use cases have to meet. And I don't think that framework really exists. It's pushed by large organizations. Clearly, Apple, Google, Salesforce have a lot of firepower to put resources behind it, but it's kind of missing for startups. And then, of course, it's also influenced by large tech on what's beneficial to them, right? If you think about GDPR, it's funny, we do quite a bit of investments actually in both continents, Europe and the US. And 4 years ago, when the GDPR discussion started to happen, I had a lot of European entrepreneurs who would tell me, well, you guys are kind of spoiled in the US because we have this big competitive disadvantage. We have to take care of all of these GDPR components and strategic thinking. And I'm like, look, it depends where you stand. If you think the world goes into that direction and privacy will become more important, you actually have a competitive advantage because you have to deal with the problem now, and you'll be ahead of the curve later, right? On the other hand, if you look at large tech, it's much easier for large tech to put resources behind, let's say, GDPR than startups, right? So having to take care of those particular aspects has a much bigger impact on resources for a small company and a large one. And so I think there's interesting issues around the blueprint and framework on how we work together, but then also about the power play, who has the resources and who has less resources to then kind of address it.
That exactly is a question from the audience, and Lene, I would like to put it to you. So how can you kind of ideally organize that collaboration between tech and of all sizes and the humanitarian community, and how should business act or businesses act in that framework?
Yeah. Thank you. If I can just respond to some of the points that Rakesh made in his, because I think it is relevant also in answering your question. I think this thing of building bridges and the speed, I think that's a very well taken point. And I think the problem is that when these bridges do not exist and you are in an emergency situation, they don't appear overnight. And for companies that have been tasked urgently to build something, if they don't have an understanding of what, say, the human rights risks associated, it's very difficult to even within the company to have that understanding of what does that mean, and this sort of sense that we sit in Geneva and expect companies to know everything about this just by osmosis. So I think it's a very good point. I think the pandemic does exacerbate and accelerate the frictions that already exist that then come out in this kind of situation. But so on the building bridges, that's what we have been investing in as the UN Human Rights Office over the last couple of years. We've had a presence, a lot of engagement with companies in Silicon Valley, because we do recognize that human rights understanding doesn't happen by osmosis. So we've tried to engage with companies quite extensively to try to talk to them about how to manage human rights risk. And we don't have all the answers. No one has all the answers, but we do believe that it does involve that collaboration, that cross-fertilization of capacities, knowledge, and ideas between the humanitarians, the human rights people, and companies, but also the role of state is important to keep in mind in this. And so the more specific, the concrete project that we are having, that I'm leading, we call it the BTEC project, which is exactly to work directly with companies and other stakeholders and trying to say, how does one think about human rights if one is a tech company? What are the kind of policies and processes that need to be in place that can then be triggered and leveraged when we are in a crisis situation? The problem is that this crisis that came so quickly, and the sector, for all the reasons that have also been covered already, that it isn't a mindset that the sector is necessarily used to be in, or in the space. It has been the sort of speed beyond anything else. I think there's the last few years, and also in terms of the political dynamic, I think the things are changing, and we've certainly in the engagement we've had over the last couple of years with companies seen a huge appetite to build these bridges, to enhance the understanding, to try to better be able to find that tech for good, as opposed to only looking at the negative side. But we're just not there quite yet, and the pandemic again has brought out the sort of the frictions in society, the role of fake news, and all the things that we know, but also that the frameworks that we're operating on are not quite joined up. We think that the human rights framework, because it is global, and because it applies, so if you're a technology company, even if you're based in Silicon Valley, your applications are used around the world. So having at least a global framework that is universally supported as the starting point for how you think about these issues is what we have been promoting, and has had very good, as I mentioned, engagement. But again, in the practical results in how companies are operating, this pandemic just came a little bit too quickly and a little bit too soon. But I think it is a joint challenge, and we do need to have that much more deep engagement that we have been trying to build up, and with some positive signals over the last couple of years.
Well, I'm wondering, and I'm picking up here a question from the audience, Martin, and modify it slightly. Yes, it would be nice if people could work together. The world would be a much better place. But I mean, it's also a power question. And I think Rakesh mentioned that. I mean, these companies have to be seen as countries, and they have their own foreign policy and their own kind of secretaries of states, and I agree with that. And so I wonder, Lene, what you think, who should take the lead? Who should determine, for example, whether it's a centralized or a decentralized solution? Aside from any kind of pros and cons of each, but who should? I mean, we have democracy for a reason. How we organize the healthcare system, and especially the reaction to the pandemic, is a very important question. So who should decide?
I mean, I think we certainly can't. I mean, it's a global governance question, really. Are the global institutions that govern the world, are they up to the challenges that technology, amongst other developments, have brought? And I think that more and more, the way we are engaging with companies reflect what in technical term I believe is called polycentric governance, where you don't see governance as only state-led and command and control driven, that there are different power centers that need to be engaged in order to develop standards and in order to implement standards. So I don't think there is one centralized actor that can lead, because I don't think that's what the world looks like. But I do think that it is important to be anchored in a set of shared values. And I think that that's where the human rights framework can come in to frame the discussions that are then had in these various where power, where governance sits in different contexts, but sort of having a shared framing, a shared foundation. And I know that in Silicon Valley, but that's a slightly different discussion, the sort of the ethics framework compared to the human rights framework, and I think both has certainly a value. Ethics tend to be more maybe context specific, whereas the human rights framework has that global authority and legitimacy that I think is important. So to sum up the answer to your question, there is no, we fool ourselves if we think that there's one leader in these debates, but it's about bringing in everyone that has a role, and that includes for sure, particularly the big tech companies that, as Rakesh and you were saying, I mean, we can't look at them as saying, well, this is just a company that is subject only to national regulation and enforcement in the company where they're incorporated. That's not how the world looks like. And our responses and approaches to try to come up with what that means in governance terms certainly should reflect that. Importantly, also when it comes to accountability, and I think that that's where there is perhaps the biggest gap. I think increasingly that understanding that everyone needs to be around the table when we're talking about what norms and what are sort of acceptable behavior. But I think still when it comes to accountability, I think that's where maybe some actors, including from the sector itself, sort of almost goes back behind, said, oh, well, this is subject only to national enforcement in the courts of the country where we choose to be incorporated. So I think one has to think broadly about what global governance means, and taking that global responsibility as part of the governance framework that also then includes accountability for behavior that might be less than ideal.
Thanks, Lene. Rakesh, one question from the audience, another question from the audience from Sydney, and it's kind of more a factual question, which I want to put to you. So could you kind of quickly explain to us kind of the difference between a centralized and a decentralized tracing solution?
Sure. So most broadly, a centralized tracing system would involve like putting all the data in one data store, whether it's a single server or some broad thing. So basically all of the data from all the individuals participating comes into one location where it can be analyzed. And that's, there were a number of these centralized systems that were created. The most famous decentralized system that's currently deployed is the protocol created by Apple and Google a couple of months ago, which has been pushed out to Android phones and iPhones around the world. And the idea is it's not really a contact tracing system so much as it is an exposure notification system. And the idea is that with these APIs, with the infrastructure in the mobile devices, governments and health authorities can then write apps that actually reach those programmatic elements that are already now on people's phones. And the idea is that it's an attempt to maintain user privacy and create a balance between individual human dignity and the liberty questions, while still giving people the ability to notify whether they've been exposed to other people in the recent past that might have had COVID-19.
Thanks, Rakesh. And let's shift gear and talk a bit about data, Balthasar. I mean, that's part of your title, and data has become very important in all parts of society and the economy. But I wanted to ask you to give us an idea how important data is in your field and in your organization, and which role it will play in that digital transformation you're working on.
Thank you. Data is incredibly important for us. People talked about data as being the new oil. And recently I've heard people talking about data as being the new asbestos. And I think it encapsulates this idea that actually there is no digitalization without, of course, massive amounts of data that are being created. And we have to be very thoughtful and responsible about it. And I think for years, many actors have either given away, and we still as individuals give away a lot of our data, or collect data and haven't thought about what it actually means. And I think we will at one stage wake up with a bit of a hangover and realize that the way we have thought about our own data, but also our organization's data, has not been up to standard. And what we try to do, and it was alluded to it, is really have quite an awareness, that we sit on a mountain of data that can be leveraged and harnessed for the good of people, but the same data can really also be turned against people. And that's a massive responsibility, which we try to show that by having stringent data protection standards, the Data Protection Office. We have an independent control commission. It's recognized by the European states that have very stringent regulations with regard to data, that we have a system in place which allows us then also to transfer data. And I want to take one example. The Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, 192 societies spanning the world, they have to shift around data. If you, for instance, lost your brother in a war zone and you look for that brother, and that brother may be dead or missing or maybe somewhere detained, we need to move around all these data. But at the same time, the data, the metadata, would also allow a government or an unstate armed group to hone in on that same brother, to find him and to kill him. And that means that the way we try to think about data is as, of course, something we will try to leverage for the good, but we also have to really protect it from any kind of non-authorized access. And that's very much a dilemma. It means data minimization, so we don't want to take data. It means data protection in the sense that we try to protect the data from any kind of access, unauthorized access. I think we have to be extremely transparent with the beneficiaries to sort of say, the data we take from you, how do we manage it? The data subjects must know and have the possibility to have access to how we try to be diligent about it. And indeed, I would sort of say the humanitarian sector at large has a responsibility, a particular responsibility going beyond other perhaps sectors, to be very thoughtful and responsible about that, and to constantly also think what new technologies mean. We have just updated our data protection handbook, and we have now reflected on blockchain, on machine learning, artificial intelligence. What does it actually mean? Because we need to harness these technologies, but we have to do so in a responsible way.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I don't know whether I broke off.
It's more concretely, give me an idea what type of data you have, and kind of in what shape, and I mean, with data, it's always a question.
I mean, the kind of data that we would have. I mean, we visit hundreds of thousands of detainees, prisoners of war, political detainees around the world, and we would register them for follow-up. We would intervene with the authorities on possible ill treatment, on torture, on the physical conditions. These are all high, and what we share and how we share it. For instance, some prisoners would sort of say, you can share overall problematics, but don't say that it was me who actually made that kind of allegation. And that's all part of a confidential dialogue with authorities, detaining authorities, to convince them to improve the way they manage detention facilities. So typically that kind of data, who said what, who is connected with whom, is very sensitive data. Vulnerabilities of people. We help, for instance, victims of sexual violence. So we have data sometimes on what had happened to them. We are a protection agency, so we collect a lot of data on violations of international humanitarian law. Very sensitive data that we wouldn't want to fall into the wrong hands. We observe conduct of hostilities, which means military strategies. Have they broken the law or not? We intervene with authorities. Highly sensitive data. We interact with 445 non-state armed groups that control the fate of people. Interacting with these groups means, of course, also knowing to a certain extent who is who in these groups. That is potentially sensitive information that could be weaponized against belligerents, and we have to stay out of armed conflict. We can't give any gain to one belligerent over another. And I could go on and on and on these data. So these data, we have to do whatever we can to use them for a purely humanitarian approach. And we had recently a discussion at the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Conference with states and the movement, where we precisely talked about this issue and sort of said, can we come to an agreement that data that we collect for humanitarian purposes, say re-establishing families that were separated by war, can we have a deal that these data will not be used and that we won't be asked to hand over these data to use them for other purposes than humanitarian? Because if we collect the data and they were to be used for other purposes, the people who collect the data, people who go into the communities, go through cross lines, go into war zones, if they are seen as collecting data for other purposes, their life is in the line of fire.
Thanks, Balthasar. I mean, Rakesh, what advice do you have for organizations like Balthasar's, how they should deal with data? I mean, Salesforce is basically a big data bank, a database for that matter, and so you've solved, or you faced many of the same problems. But what should humanitarian organizations do?
I think what we need to do is we need to have the innovation of Silicon Valley, but we need to be grounded in the values of Geneva. And what I mean by this is that we need to contextualize all. So we talk a lot about security and privacy and all these other elements, but they need to be contextualized for the humanitarian context. So for example, the issue of consent. In a humanitarian context, when a refugee is waiting to get registered at a refugee camp and they're asked for their biometric data, is consent truly possible when, if I want a place for my kids to sleep tonight, I'm going to give you whatever data has been asked of, in an uncritical way, right? There's fundamental, we talk about like, we're protective and we're the good guys and this sort of thing, but fundamentally there is a power imbalance between the helpers and the helped. And the people who, so we need to really think about how to contextualize these security and privacy issues. Another example is when we think about privacy, typically in the commercial sense, you're thinking about personal data, things like social security numbers, passport numbers, and so on. But if my goal is genocide, things that would be considered aggregate data or data that wouldn't be considered in the scope of something like GDPR can actually cause great harm. Demographic data, if your desire as an armed group is to wipe out a certain ethnic group or sectarian group, you don't need to know data about every individual there. You need to think about, the collective is enough for targeting. And so I think the humanitarian community, and I really do put this on the humanitarian community, needs to build the bridges with Silicon Valley. The conversations can't be centered in New York or Geneva. And one of the really good things that's happened in the last few years, and ICRC among many other NGOs has done and other organizations has done this, is they've started to actually hire staff here in the San Francisco Bay Area to interface with the tech community. Because like many humanitarian technology people in Silicon Valley who I work with on the social responsibility side, they don't know the difference between IFRC and ICRC and the national societies, and they don't understand what the movement means. The terminology, the basic vocabulary of humanitarianism is basically foreign to Silicon Valley. And so while we want to help out, and there are a few people who kind of bridge the world successfully, like you can go to OCHA and say, where is the training to introduce a Silicon Valley person to the cluster system, right? The United Nations cluster system that actually coordinates major emergency responses. How that works is there's no single place you can go to learn this stuff. And so if I had one ask for my humanitarian colleagues, I would say, you need to have like a humanitarianism 101 boot camp, someplace online, similar to like Open WHO, and say, here, you're a Silicon Valley person, you want to work with us, here's what you need to know, and make it happen.
Let me add one other question, related question from the audience, and the person's asking whether there's enough engagement by the tech companies with humanitarian questions. And I may add, kind of, is there? I mean, of course, there's lots of talk, but in the Valley about humanitarian questions. But I mean, there's also something like I would say, humanitarian theater. Kind of that's what you do as a tech company.
I think there's some of both. So right now, if you look at the 5 largest technology companies in terms of market capitalization, the richest tech companies on the planet, 4 out of 5 of them explicitly engage in some form of humanitarian action today. And that, now whether they are what humanitarians would consider principled actors or not is a whole other conversation. And again, this is where that education thing that I talked about needs to come back to us. I do think there is a great danger of what I would consider humanitarian whitewashing. In other words, some of these same technology companies have been implicated in grievous harms up into and including genocide and all sorts of other things. And so, you know, there is this concern that, you know, a big tech company can throw $1 million at a humanitarian, get a lot of public good, a lot of press and a lot of, you know, good press out of that conversation, but have a very material impact and yet still be, you know, complicit in grievous harms. And so I do think that there needs to be a convening of humanitarians to say, what are ethical and responsible partnerships with Silicon Valley look like? You know, and I'm going to just point out, you know, 2 names. You know, there's a big tech company down here in the Valley called Palantir that has very significant linkages to governments. And if humanitarians are doing business with an organization that has that, what are the controls? What are the guardrails in place for that sort of thing to make sure that those partnerships are respected? Because, you know, they can't be covered by an NDA. Like, what are the trust mechanisms that are in place for those kind of partnerships? Another one obviously is Facebook, right? So Facebook has been implicated by the UN for harms around the Rohingyas in Myanmar. And hate speech and catalyzing a genocide. And you know, Facebook also acts in a humanitarian capacity. And how do you square that? And I think that as the humanitarian community, you know, when we talk about principled humanitarian action, that needs to extend by necessity to the collaborations with Silicon Valley. But humanitarians, so far, in my experience anyway, have been very reluctant to think about it because, again, thinking about power imbalances, Silicon Valley has a lot of money and they also act as donors. So are you really willing to push back and create a principled framework for organizations that have a lot more money than you, have the technology you need, and have capacities and expertise that you want? And how does that work?
Philip, I mean, let me also put that question to you. I mean, what are your thoughts about how the big tech's engagement with humanitarian questions? Is it sincere? Is it theater?
But I would support anything that Rocker said. I think there's definitely initiatives of whitewashing, but I think it's also happening with ESGs and other things that make companies look better than they really are, right? One point I think that we didn't mention yet, well, I think we get there, but I have a pretty extreme view on it. I feel like, I don't know if you're Star Wars fans, but if you think about the Force, it's kind of the story of there's this there's this amazing power, and it can be exploited for the good or for the bad. Either you're a Jedi or you're kind of in the on the dark side. And I think when we think about technology, we can think about it's this force, and we are all humans. It's kind of the story about humanity on how we behave, and we are not always one and then forever on one side. We actually switch, right? So I think the real question here in terms of disengagement is, how do we build technology that is really bulletproof, independent on how systems and political systems and opinions will change? Because we can't, for example, decide today, because it seems like to be a safe decision to share, let's say, this data set with a partner, just to discover 10 years later that it was a bad idea because thousands of people died based on that data. And so I think there's real responsibility to come together and develop technology that kind of makes these things bulletproof, so that there's really interesting research and emerging technologies around. For example, can multiple data sets be shared in a way that actually the actual data doesn't get exposed, but you can derive the findings that you want in a very limited kind of defined area that all parties agree to. And so I think in terms of collaboration, I would probably say after 2016, it was really all the kids waking up in the sandbox and realizing we just got to kind of get on it. And then in the past 4 years, we saw clearly different companies being more supportive of one direction, more responsibility versus the other direction. I have to say, like to Rakesh's point, if you look at the first $1 trillion companies in terms of market cap, they're all data businesses, really, right? And the business model is it's probably the best business model invented since industrialization, because it drives a lot of value, but with it comes responsibility. And I think certain companies have done a better job versus others in order to really push the agenda there. I think COVID, if we look just at this crisis, because it has this global scope, we're in these very interesting times where we actually see how decisions are made, right? Technology is just a tool at the end of the day, but then to Lene's point, in terms of governance, we then decide how we govern it and what we do with it and who decides what happens with it and what not. And it's really interesting to observe how different countries or regions or particular industries decide on actually deploying technology right now, not just around tracing, but about a lot of other things, around testing as well, for example, and how to use the testing data in the healthcare system, how that is actually used. And it's probably the most incredible experiments that we got forced into to really generate new ideas on how technology, like humans and machine, can come together to solve the problem.
Thanks, Philip. And Lene wanted to come in on the partnership question, but before she does, let me quickly announce that we're going to have a little poll soon. One question you have to answer, and let's then talk about the results to wrap this up. So Lene, go ahead.
Yeah, just very quickly picking up on Rakesh's point again around the partnering and the engagement. And I mean, as I mentioned in my introduction, we have invested over the last 3 years quite heavily in having people in Silicon Valley, exactly for the reasons that you mentioned, that it is that building up that relationship and that mutual understanding and trust, and going back to trust again, we think is just a very important strategy. The UN is not always a very easy partner for actual partnerships. We have managed to have a big partnership with Microsoft, and we've been engaging with other companies in the sector as well to try to come in as equal partners in a way, to say, well, we bring different things, and it doesn't have to be that you become swallowed. And many of the actors, as Rakesh was also saying, I mean, they can do a lot of good things, but they can also be involved in things that is very serious. So obviously, as we are, it's not about not engaging, as I think Kofi Annan was the one saying, the angels don't need us, when he was asked why the UN was engaging with companies that were involved in human rights abuse. There is a way of engaging that doesn't mean that we are condoning or blue washing or whatever. So provided one has the right parameters to guide and to frame the engagement, the partnerships, and the discussion, I think it's the only way forward to engage even with the worst actors, a little bit like ICRC, in a way where that is how one can try to change behavior. And of course, if there is absolutely no willingness to change, then you will reconsider eventually. But I think we certainly, as UN Human Rights, has taken that approach that more engagement is better than less engagement, because us sitting in Geneva and saying this is, pronouncing and issuing edicts, we have to follow that up with a willingness to also get our hands a little bit dirty and really try to work on the practical challenges and understand the practical challenges while promoting our principle-based approaches to finding solution and to human rights impact.
Thanks, Lene. I mean, again, the poll is just coming up, and I think you have a minute to click on the answer. If you could do that now. For some reason, it doesn't work for me. But anyway, Balthasar, there's another question from the audience, and I think this is for you. And Adam is asking, so why do we worry about the private sector? Isn't the problem kind of the governments and humanitarian organizations which keep kind of data in a very insecure form, like in spreadsheets, and it's all over the place, and all that kind of. So I guess it's kind of a data security question for you.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Perhaps if I take a step back, I hear a lot of questions where we sort of lump all the tech companies together and how should.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Not sure. You can't hear me? You can't hear me?
No, it's better. Thank you.
Oh, it's better. Apologies. No, I was wondering whether this sort of lumping together of tech companies or lumping together of governments actually makes sense. I think it's a question of how do you engage which type of states, which type of companies. And in this sense, I think in the engagement with tech companies, and we also have colleagues in the Bay Area helping with that to open doors. It's the question: do you engage to influence them? Do you engage to partner them? Do you engage to use their technology? And I think we are also, with regard to states versus tech company, probably on the eve of a renegotiation of who has which kind of power. Will there be regulation or not? But it's all about currently in the engagement about building good practice, building responsible practice in a transparent way. And I think the jury is the people watching these corporations that have to be transparent way. But I think the diversity among tech companies, but also the diversity of states is so important that we can't give black and white answers to these questions. It's how do you smartly engage to influence them. I also would like to emphasize that I think humanitarians who approach tech companies aren't quite as, it's not as badly skewed as perhaps it was suggested by some. True, tech companies have often technology, they have money, they have power, but I think humanitarian organizations have in a crystallized way some of the key challenges that will be important to tech companies, the overall issue around trust, the overall issue of data management. What humanitarian organizations face in conflict zones and in emergency zones is in a way like magnifying, crystallizing issues where I feel the dialogue helps sometimes also tech companies to rethink the way they develop and deploy technology, and they seem to be interested in it. And I think it goes beyond simply sort of greenwashing or whatever you call it, but I think there is a true interest to think through these issues and also to be prepared of a renegotiation with civil society and governments of their role and their boundaries.
Thank you, Balthasar. So to wrap this up, let's look at the results of the polls, which I do not have, but here we go. And I see that most people's opinion did not change. So my guess is we didn't do a good job in a way, but perhaps we did. Anyway, thank you very much to all panelists. That was great. I think we could continue, and perhaps we can do this in person at some point when things are back to normal, if they ever get back to normal. Again, thanks for inviting me to moderate this panel. And for some closing words, I give Gioia Deucher from Swissnex, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ludwig. Thank you to all the speakers. I think we heard a lot of things that will stick with me. We talked about very early on the techno-solutionism, that idea of Silicon Valley moving fast. And I think there is power in that. But with great power comes great responsibility. We need to think of big tech companies as actors just like states. We talked about the force. The force can be used for good or it can be used for bad. But really it comes all down to trust. And how can we build the trust? How can we make sure that there is more collaboration between the humanitarian field and the technology field? And this won't happen by osmosis, as Lene said, but it has to really come with a very proactive, systematic approach and a sustained approach. Where all the power centers can be engaged in conversations. Maybe we need a humanitarianism 101, like Rakesh also suggested, something that helps people in the Silicon Valley that want to engage in humanitarian efforts, understand better how it actually works. And we have to make sure we also at the same time think of how we build technologies from the get-go to actually serve purposes in the humanitarian sector in the best possible way while protecting the most vulnerable people. The idea of data protection by design. Is data oil or is it asbestos? I think the jury is out on this question. It's probably both. It depends on how we build our technologies and how we find frameworks for the two sectors to converse more closely and actually build the technology solutions that can be contextualized and actually serve the purposes also of the humanitarian sectors for the people that we need to protect. So I think this is what I'm taking away. Thank you everybody very much for this very interesting conversation. I also want to mention here, Pier 17, which we see in some of our backgrounds here, is a place where we have been hosting these kinds of conversations to bring together the Geneva values and the Silicon Valley force, let's say, and increase the dialogue between these two very, very central and important regions of the world. We have another event tomorrow, just to mention, same time. It will be again around the UN 75th anniversary, but tomorrow we will focus on the question of what multilateralism might look like and could look like in the future in this digital age that we find ourselves in. How do we need to think of it and how we need to reform it? And that will be in collaboration with the DiploFoundation and with ICT for Peace. So I highly encourage you all to also participate tomorrow. We have some very interesting speakers and we will break out into workshops, and it will be again in close collaboration and support with the Consulate General of Switzerland here in San Francisco, but also with the Republic and Canton of Geneva. And I want to thank everybody at this point for joining and hope also for your active participation, lots of questions. That was great. And we hope to see you all tomorrow. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.